Surf's up, everybody. We're back with the Mauisnake show. This has taken an obviously long hiatus as I was wondering what I wanted to even do with the show and if I could be consistent with it. And I've realized the easiest way to make the show possible is just do shows whenever I feel like it with whoever I can get. So that's why I've brought Yumi on board. Yumi actually has done a great job of ruining his sleep schedule for the IEM Sydney event, and that's why I wanted to pick his brain about the first Tier 1 CS2 event. So, Yumi, first of all, I should give a little bit of an intro because some people might not know who you are. Yumi is a Tier 2 caster. I'd say the best or most prominent event that you worked was the Asia RMR in Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia, where you were casting alongside Tea Time. He also worked Flashpoint 2, if people remember that. And yeah, Yumi, CS2, IEM Sydney. What are your first impressions of CS2 as a game being played competitively?
I I was actually very reluctant to a lot of the changes, especially with MR12 and uh, HE's making noises when people take tag damage and things like that. I was very reluctant to that, but I actually quite enjoyed watching this event at certain points of certain legs of the tournament. I think there is definitely things to be said about, formats and whether or not it's actually good to have MR12 in a competitive environment, but from like a viewing experience, I actually enjoyed how close or weird some of the rounds got in CS2 at least. So I'm still very middle of the ground. Like I still think that there needs to probably be more sample size or more tournaments to be held before I really give a proper insight into it. But for now, I'm okay with where we stand.
Yeah, and with the game being watched, I would say that one thing is that I have to separate what it feels like to play the game right now, which I don't actually enjoy, with the fact
Mhm.
that when professionals are playing it, they're not really worrying about and nitpicking of these little things in a live match. When they're playing for prize money, when they're playing for their careers, they're going to do away with the complaints that they have for the game, even though they can be pretty vocal on Twitter. Like some of the people like that even went deep into this tournament, I would say, I think Floppy, for example, has been fairly critical on Twitter of the game itself, but that doesn't seem to stop him from being a massive beast when it comes to playoffs and how he did it this one. So I kind of have to agree though. Like CS2, there I will almost say though, like there's not the biggest difference other than the nades blowing the smokes. I feel like if I'm just watching things on a macro level, teams are still more or less trying to play a very similar way, and I'm not really seeing any kind of massive innovations yet with the game beyond just simply using grenades in a slightly different way.
Yeah, I think as well, like the teams are playing similar, but the pace of rounds felt like way quicker. Like I understand that the game is shorter inherently because of less rounds, but we just saw so many rush plays in the group stage, and I don't know if that's them capitalizing on best of ones and playing to a different pace than what we're used to in the competitive environment. But the games in general were just so much more chaotic and brawly than I'm used to seeing it at an event like this. This actually reminded me a lot of watching, a lot of these like online cup type games with less experienced teams, but we're suddenly looking at like FaZe, ENCE, Navi, Gamer Legion, going with very similar sort of baseline strategies and it working out pretty well. I still think the rounds got very like close and ended up in a lot of like 2v2s and 3v3s in those mid rounds because of just like explosive openings that people were going for.
Right. I mean, okay. One thing I have to say as a positive, because there's a lot of negative concerns with
Hmm.
CS2, is the game is just simply prettier. This was much nicer to look at in terms of just the gun skins look better, the ragdolls are they're more interesting, the way that people die. Uh, I think that just the way that light hits in the game is just so much more aesthetically pleasing. So overall, as a viewing experience, it does kind of feel like we've jumped into a new age. Like we've actually like CS:GO, for all the memes and everything, people are like dark, scary. It's basically just a mil spec game. It's just a game
Yeah.
where it's supposed to look very realistic, but it could have done with looking a little bit prettier, and now CS2 has brought that. So I would say that if people now, one thing is if people are a casual fan or just kind of watching for the esports side of things, I think it's probably going to hold someone's attention for just a little bit longer, just because it looks a little bit sharper. And that actually, to me, it kind of does matter, even though some people are saying performance issue, like maybe not everybody in the world can play the game on their 15-year-old computer as much anymore, but I don't think that's a huge detriment, although I do think that the casual player base should be welcomed. I think that people should be able to play on any system, and I think that's one reason that Valorant does very well, where the specs are very, like, you don't really need a sick computer to run Valorant, and I think that the requirements are probably a little bit more rigorous for CS2 right now. But all in all, I'm just overall very satisfied with the fact that the game just looks better.
Yeah, and also for a first tournament, like the exciting thing was seeing how teams use the HEs and the smokes and everything, because that's another thing that's going to really engage you as a viewer, going like, oh my god, I didn't even think about that application, or that's actually so strong. Why don't I do that in my games? You know, that is one of the advantages with the way that Valve have implemented, even in the rollout to the competitive environment, is that they've made everything uniform. So now I can do everything that I see on screen in my Premiere games, and it's very one-to-one transferable. So yeah, I mean, I think for a first tournament, it accomplishes all the things that you want it to do from Valve's point of view. You know, it is better to look at, but then there's new things that can sort of pique your interest.
Okay, let's get into some of the teams here. So first off, obviously, FaZe winning this event, to me, well, okay, for like, this is a weird tournament because for FaZe, I always just feel like coming into every single event, do they have motivation to actually play well? Because that's kind of been the key theme for them tournament to tournaments, like Katowice, Cologne. Always feels like they'll try a little bit harder. Majors, of course, they'll, even if their results don't necessarily speak for that, it does seem like they have a certain mindset where other events, maybe they're a little bit more relaxed, especially towards the tail end of a season. I always felt like FaZe was just kind of running on fumes. I would start to see the same strats run over and over again. I wouldn't feel like even the players are as connected as they usually are. But at this tournament, I would say pretty confidently that they came into it with enough vigor that I don't think I would have actually necessarily from the get-go said FaZe looked incredibly sharp. I think they even, yeah, they lost to Gamer Legion to kick off the entire event. But as the tournament went on, I did start to see signs for them, and actually on my pick stop, I actually put them to make it to the grand finals. I felt like they were pretty, their side of the bracket didn't seem as strong going into the playoffs. But I will say that, like, individuals on the team, like Rain doing very well, like Rain having a ton of impact, and just the way that they were even able to play off of each other, especially down the stretch against Complexity. All of that to me was like, okay, the focus that FaZe brought into this event definitely looked better. So what do you think of FaZe?
Yeah, no, I mean, I didn't have them pegged to win this event, or I didn't even have them pegged to really make it into like the semifinals. I thought they maybe scrape through the quarters and then lose there. Because I'm kind of down on FaZe because of the fact that they seem to have that motivation issue, and they've even said it in interviews that it's kind of hard to stay motivated in a game that you've done and accomplished so many different things in, and now moving into CS2, like they feel like they've reinvigorated themselves. Cool, I get it. But I think the big thing for them is, yeah, you highlight Rain as an important piece, but that seems to be like the winning formula for FaZe, is that Rain has a solid tournament, Brokey, and then +1, whether that's Twistzz or Rops. And this at this event, it was Rops. Like on an individual standpoint, FaZe do have the firepower. It just feels like sometimes you don't see, you know, Rops take that risk that will suddenly get him 2 kills through a smoke, or you don't see Brokey going into his sort of chaotic shotgun AWPing positioning that he did a whole lot of at this tournament. But yeah, I still didn't, even when they made it through the finals and they beat all these teams, I almost felt like we got an underperformance from some of the teams that they faced in the playoffs, rather than FaZe playing exceptionally. Like, they exploited a lot of gaps in the teams that they faced, like ENCE in particular. I think Maus were very much the same. But the teams were also leaving these massive gaps and then just completely disregarding that space in the map, and then getting caught off by it instead of it being like a good timing and a good aim duel won by one of the FaZe players, for example.
It does seem like if you're gonna play more reactive versus a team like FaZe is going to be the team that tests your limits. If you do leave those gaps, it's always like it's not that necessarily to me always FaZe elevates their play in these kinds of moments. It's that other teams sort of fall off, like you're saying. It's like
Mhm.
it's like, for example, when one thing I really liked, and I think that it's sort of a vague term that people love to throw around, is experience. So, for example, FaZe came across very experienced when they played these playoffs, even though it's the first time that CS2 is being played. And what I mean by that more specifically is that if FaZe were to see something in a match and then the team against them is trying to repeat that sort of play to try to exploit FaZe isn't going to get caught off twice by it. So, for example, in the waning moments of map 3 versus complexity, for example, Halzerk was trying to go for a cave peek with the op, and he was able to get a kill onto Rain, which found an opener, which actually led to complexity, finding a 5v4 and winning a round. But then Halzerk he wanted to do it again. I think he wanted to do it maybe in the next overtime after that. He wanted to do the same play, and Rain's just not going to let that happen. Like that's where FaZe is always going to step up, where it's one of those fool me once, fool me twice kind of moments with FaZe, where they're just, if you really try to do the same thing to them again, these guys have all enough experience under their belt that they're just going to make the necessary micro adaptations so that you can't really just run the same play to them over and over again, whether that's playing around a certain smoke, going for a spam, or just kind of positioning. Like Rain in cave against Halzerk in these kind of moments he's just a little bit more careful, knowing that, oh, you might actually send an op in my face, and so I need to play tucked into a corner and just like play to try to beat an op. Like the way his mechanics work, like he understands how to do it, and anybody that's played in this kind of situation gets what I mean too.
That's the round where I think he was on T side, right? Like Halzerk's picking into cave with the AWP on T side, and
Yes.
he gets
Yeah.
like double naded. He gets naded from Rops on site, I think. Like they knew he was coming, right? Because
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
remember that round and thinking like that is like the first off, that's a perfect nade from Rops, because like that had to have been on the fly, just thinking like, oh, he's still going for that peak. Okay, let me nade him, and they just kill him with utility instead. Like
Mm-hmm.
I remember that specifically, and yeah, it's a great example of what you're talking about.
And it's just like they're so adaptable FaZe, and that's why in a funny way actually, when I was kind of thinking about what teams would be good for the first handful of months going into CS2, FaZe was actually not very high on my list, because I thought that if you're younger, you're probably gonna end up being better. You're gonna like put more time into it right away. But I think that FaZe just kind of hit the perfect storm of people are incredibly experienced on this team. They know how to deal with a ton of different Counter-Strike situations. And so given that really the tactics of the game haven't changed too much, or the mechanics of the game haven't changed too much beyond being able to blow away smokes, you're basically just playing Counter-Strike, but it's a little bit jankier. And so the whole, like, if your ideas overall are just good, you're probably going to come out ahead more times than not, even if things in the micro aren't always going expected. Like a smoke might bloom in a weird way, or you might be able to shoot around a smoke that gives you a certain vantage point. And I feel like it's almost like when you have all of those repetitions under your belt, you're more likely to be able to see something and be like, using your new CS2 brain, just slightly modify the way that you handled that situation before and adapt it to this new game. And I'd say another thing that motivated FaZe, probably the fact that they know that this is perhaps their last tournament. And that's kind of the next thing I want to breach with this topic, is that with FaZe, there's been all of this news and information that they're going to be bought out by the parent company of Complexity, and so we might not see this roster anymore. And it's kind of a swan song here in Sydney for this team, and I think that also motivated them to pick up their level of play. But I want to just kind of throw this idea out there, Yumi. If you were the parent company right now, how would you make the decision for, if, let's say they actually don't allow, like ESL, Blast, whoever, they don't allow FaZe and Complexity to run in the same tournaments due to conflict of interest? How would you move forward if you were that company with the roster you want to send?
Well, I do like a prediction series with another YouTuber, and I actually have talked about this a few times about how FaZe, because their stock price was so low and having a Counter-Strike team is such a massive overhead, I actually didn't even know that FaZe were going to be able to maintain contracts with this team for a long time. And then the question was going to be whether they stay as five and try and find a new organization or what. So this actually happening kind of coincides with the idea that this FaZe roster is going to break up. And if you're the parent company, it is actually, I think, an easy decision to make because complexity, from my understanding, don't cost as much to run their Counter-Strike organization. They're also way more market fixated in North America than FaZe are able to market to sponsors. Um, for anybody that's sort of out of the loop, for organizations when they secure sponsors, a lot of the time those marketing budgets come from regional directives within these companies. So if you're, say, I don't know, let's use Steel Series because they happen to be FaZe's sponsor. Like the EU marketing team probably look at that and just go, okay, there's a bunch of people from different parts of the EU or different parts of Europe, and we're just gonna try and we'll attach ourselves to FaZe here. You know, they're a big brand with a lot of pulling power in the community. That works for us. But if you're trying to say run an independent campaign in, say, like Sweden or the Nordic countries, it's actually much harder if you don't have somebody from that organization or from that region on the team to make a campaign like that work. You can maybe pull Rain, I guess, but then if you want to somehow go somewhere else and that team doesn't have it, then it's much more difficult. But whereas for North America, it's more holistic. It's easier to get a larger viewership base, and so if you're Complexity or if you're GameStop, is it
Yeah.
games? Yeah,
Yeah, GameStop.
GameStop, GameSquare. I forget. It's
GameSquare is
one
the
of those
parent
two.
company, but GameStop's
Yes,
like a primary
GameSquare.
sponsor. I think that's the sponsor for
Okay.
Complexity. Yeah.
Yeah, so Gamesquare, if you're Gamesquare, like if you're thinking about profitability and long-term effects, like yeah, you keep the North American roster because you can more easily market to the North American crowd than anything that what you're hoping to do with the FaZe roster, which is it's a shame. It is a shame, but that's also kind of how business works sometimes.
Right, right. And so if you were the on the managing side, if you were someone that was making decisions at GameSquare, does that mean you would probably go with Complexity, or how would you shake things up?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'd stick with complexity. I'd maybe try and, if from my point of view, if you're going to lose out on one roster, you do your best to salvage with what pieces you have, but then you weigh up the brand identity risks. Do you bring in some of these EU players to complexity because then you somehow morph the identity away from being, oh, NA's back at it again, to now we've got this weird amalgamation or conglomerate squad. Ah, I would have liked to see maybe Twistzz, for example. If you're gonna take somebody out of the roster, Twistzz is like a perfect fit. Or even, and I'm sure we'll touch on complexity independently later, but you could have even maybe stolen Brokey if there was any sort of leveraging power that way, because both of them make it into the grand finals. That's actually that's actually makes a greater argument for you to keep complexity because they're just as successful as FaZe in terms of getting to grand finals in the new game.
That's I like the Twistzz idea. We'll get into where Twistz's likely landing spot actually is
Mhm.
later on, and I think the Brokey one is kind of interesting too because I'd say one for one, the if you go down the list of all of these players on both teams, you would probably lean slightly towards FaZe for practically everybody, even given CS2. Like, I mean, in the history, if it were CS:GO, it's no question you would want to probably, like, for the quality of the team, take FaZe. But the fact that Complexity were legitimately a round away, or they were, they went into overtime against FaZe, always from comeback positions, but to get that deep into double overtime, actually, that shows that when it comes to CS2, these teams aren't really far off from each other. If you ran that back, it's not impossible that Complexity win one out of a couple of matches. Like, even if you'd run it back one time, they could have probably beat FaZe again, or they could have tried to actually beat FaZe. But I'd say that when I look at these teams, and to just kind of answer the question myself of what I would move forward with, I think the costs is probably just too obviously in favor of Complexity. I would assume, without saying numbers specifically, like, I would, in a kind of a vague sense, I would assume that most people on FaZe are making about 30,000 a month, and people on Complexity are probably making about 10,000 a month. And So you're paying 1/3 per month for this roster in Complexity, and like you said, you have the North American market who will be backing Complexity more, just as a whole unit. Whereas with FaZe actually have, I'd say, a great fan base in America. And I will say that when going to international events, I would always notice, I'd say the most fans for any team was probably whatever team Fallen's on. And then Navi was probably second. And then actually beyond that it was probably G2, and then kind of a nice mix of FaZe and Liquid, I would say. So they do have a really strong fan base. It's hard to test that against Complexity because Complexity was rarely getting deep enough into these tournaments where you would see droves of Complexity fans or jerseys for that matter. But if Complexity can actually maintain the form that they showed in Sydney, being a top 2 team at this tournament, having a very strong chance of winning the entire thing, and the fact that you're paying them about 1/3 of what FaZe is making, I think this is more or less a no-brainer. I don't think that there's really any question to me.
Yeah, I think as well, it's just FaZe don't have a very specific brand identity. Like Complexity are what it's the Cowboys, right? I don't
Yeah.
really know much about like football or anything.
They're
Um,
they're they're like
but
they're actually the nation's most popular NFL team.
well, there you go. But they share that brand identity in terms of being like performance driven. Like Complexity are an esports organization and are targeting specifically the esports market, whereas FaZe are trying to be a bit more endemic to like lifestyle and
Yeah.
trying to be a part of the general culture. Like they reach out to rappers and artists and actors, and they're trying to pull in as much of the general audience outside of esports to their brand. And sure, they have a lot of pulling power in that regard. I'd at least wager. But the esports jersey thing, I think, is just kind of esports fans are, I think, pretty pragmatic, and you are probably going to buy a jersey for a team that you think is going to make it quite deep into a tournament. So G2 FaZe, that makes sense to me. And if you're a Brazilian fan, you just follow the top Brazilian team.
Yeah.
So I don't know that that's a real indicator because you're trying to support esports. You want to be seen as a part of the esports crowd, and you pick the best jersey you can, so to speak. Um, but yeah, I think it's just harder to market FaZe in the esports exclusive angle because they're trying to be a good esports performance team, but everything else about them is like content creation and lifestyle. So I think that's probably what's going to happen is that FaZe are going to go more push further and further into the lifestyle and content creation area, and then Complexity are just like the performance driven esports team for Gamesquare.
Yeah, I think that's a really valid point. Is that I think the majority of FaZe fans are kind of fans of the people that are in the FaZe house in Los Angeles, and it's people like FaZe Banks, and I mean I don't really know all those people because it's an influencer culture that I'm not really as attuned
Hmm.
with. But with their esports thing, it's always kind of just felt like it's something that they're willingly dumping money into the entirety of FaZe, but it was never, it would give them some notability, and it kind of gave their fan bases another way to attach themselves to it. But I would say at the end of the day, there are going to be a lot of people that are disappointed to see FaZe pulling out of esports. But if that is the case, I don't think that's actually going to be too big of a hit to them because in terms of just finances, it is kind of a money sink for them. I don't think they're. I think the sticker money is probably one way that they actually make a lot back from FaZe, and the jersey sales, sure, maybe there's that too, and some sponsor deals. But being a solo influencer content creator is so much more lucrative if you're just trying to talk about the bottom line. If you just have one dude, a camera crew, an editor, and he makes a video like Mr. Beast or whatever, it's the amount you can make off of that is just so much easier because you're kind of dictating your own salary and those kinds of things. You don't have to really salary yourself in the exact same way. But I mean, I know that FaZe is probably actually, they probably are giving quite a bit to their content creators too, but it's just that it's one guy who's making a video that literally has returns in ad revenue directly connected to the video he just made, along with the sponsors that are attaching themselves to the video. It's kind of just an easier marketing ploy. So
Hmm.
let's talk about the other grand finalist team, though. Obviously, we've touched upon them. Complexity, their run of form at this tournament was really impressive. I would say that when they first picked up a Liege, it almost felt like this was a lateral move when they over Fang, but I would say that within just a couple months' time, it is clearly an upgrade. And this has kind of done everything that people have wanted to do for Complexity, where they bring in a veteran voice. They, in some ways, get over their choking issue, which was really plaguing them when they had Fang on the team. And it seems like actually beyond that, Elige and what he's brought to this team has elevated the performance of a couple of his teammates around him, Floppy being the most obvious benefactor, but surprisingly, also JT played very well as an individual too.
Yeah, I was. He might not have had the like a standout statistical performance. Like he was still the lowest rated player on Complexity, but JT was having crazy rounds. Like I think he won the most clutches at this event as well. It was kind of staggering to see him get off to like flying starts. Like when we saw the opening 4 or 5 rounds, JT would have at least 6 or 7 kills and maybe no deaths. You know, he was having that kind of impact at the start of games, which can also just help set the tone. And not to mention the benefits of having an early advantage in MR12. You know, I did feel like the perfect storm for Complexity in a way. But I always thought that Elige move was extremely underrated because I think maybe people were a little, or maybe I was too naive to think it could go wrong. But the idea that he was removed from the team that he had been with for the longest time, which seemed to be part of the issue with his character traits that seemed to sort of harbor ill will with his teammates, perhaps. That's always going to be a humbling experience, I feel, then going into someone else's project and trying to justify your worth. So, Elige, for me, like, this is a nice redemption arc for him to show that he can still do it. He can have a change of attitude or a change of personality, so to speak, and actually have that influence like you're talking about as a veteran player. I mean, I couldn't have been happier for Complexity, really. Aside from, you know, thinking about how the ways in which they could have won this final, because there were points where they definitely could have won this final had they got maybe 20% more out of players like Holzerk, or, you know, not lost to so many low buys. But that was unfortunately an ailment that many teams had at this event, is losing to those low buys. So it's not just them.
Yeah, would you blame the strength of lower buys? Do you think that has to do with the fact that CS2's mechanics are different?
Yeah, almost certainly.
Yeah, I would have to agree. I think the way that people like the multi spray downs were so much rarer. Like anytime someone hit a spray transfer here, like I remember Elige actually hit a really critical spray transfer on Ancient. I think it was in overtime. Like he killed 2 people on the jump up position when he was coming into mid from elbow late into a round. He killed, I think, the first guy. The second guy I remember was Twistzz, and he just kind of like flicked him with a headshot in a spray transfer. And I was just shocked. I almost was like, oh wow, someone hit a spray transfer in a match. Like it seems so much rarer, and where like in CS2 it always kind of almost felt like the most like the clip that is seared into my brain was Chiron flanking on Mirage earlier in the tournament when he put his crosshair right on somebody that was at around empty pillar, and he shot them in the side of the head, and he had to take 11 bullets to kill a guy that wasn't looking at him and standing still. And that was a moment where I was like, oh man, CS2's mechanics are still very janky, and people are not killing people as quickly as they would be in CSGO. And I think that's probably why those pistol rounds were so effective. Like if you just had a few Tech 9s and maybe like throw in a deagle and just, I mean, any kind of light pop onto the bomb site with a flash or smoke, it did feel like it got a bit more mileage at this event. Just because, and maybe that's like confirmation bias. I'd love to see if there's stats on it. I'd love to see if there's numbers that can show that those were more effective, because it really just felt like the riflers on bomb sites were not able to produce the multi-frags that they normally would, because the gunplay just felt a little bit more muddied.
Yeah, and I feel like Deagles were doing. I mean, we see nice Deagle work at big events usually, especially when we hit LAN. But because of the way that Subtick works with like favor the shooter type gameplay, it does feel as though you just get that like extra half second to, or not half second, maybe like a quarter of a second to aim and hit that target before they're even really on the screen of the person holding an angle. So I think HLTV actually did like a review, so to speak, of the event with like multiple pro players, where they just asked like, how is CS2 online versus on LAN?
Hmm.
and most of them said that the LAN experience is much better. Like they're not dying around corners as much. I think I noted like first day of group stage that I was seeing players actually get away with jiggle peeking, which if
Yeah.
anyone's playing Premier, that doesn't exist. You jiggle peek an angle, you're dying every time. So I like that some of those things did come back on LAN, but it does just I think to me it highlights how far CS2 has to go in terms of like the online competitive experience because a lot of the things that you saw at Sydney may not be I mean just probably aren't going to be able to be replicated online even to
Hmm.
like the smallest even just like those minute details. So
Yeah, yeah. To keep it a little bit more though, on back to complexity, I do want to kind of talk about the Elige effect a little bit more.
mhm.
Some of like the way that I would say complexity now plays is just it's just more active than what I remember them doing before, and I know that Floppy has said it in an interview. I think JT probably brought it up too. I think at least multiple players from Complexity have brought up Elige's effect and what he has brought in terms of experience and the way that he's inserted. I think they said code words or just he's shortened a lot of things for them so that if they have a read of what's happening on the map or they want to do something, the communicative process there has been abridged so much that it's a lot easier for them to just get their words out quicker. Because I noticed this actually when I play with people that have played at like a tier 2 tier 1 level, and when I play with people that have not played competitively, is that the people that I play with that are not competitive players, they kind of have they're just very lengthy when they have to describe what it is that they're doing. And this is admittedly like when I played with like mostly other broadcast talent actually, where I'm like, oh, like you're framing what you want to say in a way that's good for broadcast where it's very wordy. But in terms of like when I'm playing with ex competitive players, I would usually say something like, flash this corner for me. Like, I don't need to explain it. It doesn't need to be anything more than that. And I bet when it's a Liege who's played for so much longer at tier 1 than the complexity guys, he probably even shortens it more so. He's almost like aggro flash or something. It's probably just simple term. Everybody can then doesn't have to like hear this person talking too much, and then they could just enact the play that they want to make, and it just like allows everybody else across the map to focus more. Because actually, in a funny way, Counter-Strike would be so much more interesting if you had two push to talk binds, or like you knew who you could direct your chatter to, where you could always just be in the ear of your bomb site mate, and then you guys could just have a little one-on-one conversation on your side of the map, and then the other guys on the other side of the map could have their conversation, and you're not mudding up the comms for everybody at the same time, because you would probably be a little bit more active, and you also would probably just hear more of the things you want to hear, aka if your bomb site teammate wants to do something, that's all you're hearing, and you don't have to hear the fact that I'm playing banana but someone's saying flash me into apartment halls. Like, I don't care. I don't want to hear that almost ever, because it's only going to take away info from what's in front of me.
It's actually one of the things I've thought about with like teams that have been together for such a long time because I imagine there is like a voice hierarchy, so to speak, where there's one person that's dictating rotates on either bomb site. That's if he says that they're coming B, you're bringing a rotate out from the other bomb site. That's fine. But every other comm from the supportive player is saying like, oh, I'm gonna flash this or I'm smoking this. That's probably all tuned out from like the rotator players to the other bomb site players. They just don't even think about what that guy's saying at all ever because otherwise it's just too much. Like you said, it's just information that you don't need to have at any given point. So yeah, I mean, it's a little thought exercise, perhaps. Yeah, maybe having like proximity targeted voice could be interesting.
Yeah, yeah. Whenever the technology's there in CS3, maybe we can get that to happen.
Yeah, God.
Wait, but
I do. Sorry, just jumping back into complexity
yeah.
because I do think that I think holes are kind of fantastic finals. But I think it's as well before we got to the finals it did seem as though he was struggling to have input on this team, whether it came to T or CT sides. I think we saw, like you're sort of mentioning, complexity seemed to have some very active plays, and I think on CT in particular, they were going with like a lot of uh, opening ideas that worked to get map control, and they did it very very well. Um, but for them, when that breaks down, maybe that's where Halzerk sees the most activity it just almost felt like he wasn't a part of those types of plays because I very rarely saw rounds in which he was able to have impact in the same way that you would maybe get like Elige or JT being those space takers ahead of him. So it's I think Complexity did great at this event, but I also don't think it's going to be the most transferable to future events, unfortunately, because you almost hit like this perfect storm of Elige and JT having like crazy impact, and then players like Floppy as well, who just like, saw this amplification. I don't think they're going to get away with that at the next event because one, they'll be more studied on, and two, you're probably not going to get that kind of performance out of JT at every event.
The JT concern is very real, and one where you could expect that JT will regress in some ways back to his usual form. I do think that it's possible, though, that CS2 and maybe the mechanics of it, there's just like such fine details that seem like they can lend themselves to some players over others, and I haven't really broken down in my head at least yet what I think that all of those necessarily are, but it's possible that a couple of those influence JT's performance positively in a way that is replicable. Although I wouldn't expect him to be the most clutch player, for example. Like
Mhm.
having the most clutches is not something where I think the mechanics are going to always serve JT in some fantastic way. But in terms of just 50-50 gunfight duels, I do think that maybe JT could have benefited from the upgrade to the new game. But the Hulzerk thing is interesting. I want to kind of break that down just for a second. I think like something that's interesting with this is that there's news on the horizon that OC is available to look at options and shop himself around, and it's for a lot of people in North America, it's their dream to see OC reunited with Complexity because this is kind of the core that came up together. Floppy, JT, OC on the Extra Salt lineup. A lot of us in on this side really want it to happen. But what would you think? Because I would assume you have a slightly less biased opinion of just wanting to see a fairy tale reunion.
It just feels like it doesn't feel like an upgrade. It feels like you're getting the same, like it's the same input as the output. And I will say I have been impressed with OC because I think with Liquid he was actually going for a lot of like individual like opener fights like we want to see out of star level opers, and when he was hitting it, it looked great. And maybe you need OC. The thing is, I think OC commands more space in the current complexity than Holzerk does, which is weird because I think when Holzerk first joined the roster, it almost felt like he was the one calling the shots, like being that European import. But now that he spent more time with them, it's like he simmered down and he just like trusts the system or doesn't have plays that he wants to make. I'm sure if he called them, he'd still get them. But yeah, I do wonder whether OC's the added chemistry of bringing him back and me knowing that OC is like quite an active communicator could be enough of a benefit, but it just doesn't feel like on a firepower outlet like an upgrade.
I kind of wanted you to say something like that because it brings myself and probably a lot of listeners back to earth because I would have I it's so clear to me where my bias is when I actually really think about OC on Liquid. He never really was this masterful performer that was performing well beyond the team. It usually even felt like OC was the one place where you'd look at the roster and say this is where they could upgrade it. But so many people who watched OC come up with the Extra Salt lineup and just earlier on in his career knew that he had more to give. But when we say that we knew he had more to give, or when I say I knew he had more to give, it was generally speaking against worser competition when I saw that more that he had. So it was that he was getting punished less for I wouldn't even really say repeaks, but I would just say missing. Whereas now in high level tier 1 CS, OC makes a lot of great plays, but if you don't hit your shots with a certain level of success rate, then those opportunities that you simply missed on are not going to come back. The tier 1 teams are going to start constricting you and all the plays that you want to make, and Whereas before I was really high on OC because he could carve out so many shots in a round for himself. Against tier 1 competition, sometimes you just get 3 shots in a round, and you're never really going to find the 6th or 7th shot that in even sometimes when OC was first coming into tier 1, he would find those. But once people started game planning around him just a little bit more, I just don't think he's a lot of those opportunities. So I kind of see what you mean with that. I think that when I think of the reality of the move, if Complexity would pick up OC, I imagine that the buyout on OC is probably fairly hefty. And if what you're saying is how most people read it, if they have a slightly more objective viewpoint, then why would you pay, and I'll just throw out a random number, like a several $100,000 buyout on a player who maybe is like a 5% upgrade over Halzerk? Like, I will say this, I do think OC is better than Halzerk, but only by a margin of maybe 10%. And that's being maybe generous, you know? Like, I mean, I would say the absolute most that OC is better than Halzerk is sub 20%. That is the best I could give him. I don't think he is any more, like, that's why if it's like a several $100,000 buyout and your Complexity, who we were just saying, parent org Gamesquare is going for what's the most financially stable and lucrative position on all of this, why would you throw hundreds of thousands of dollars when it's not really going to give you too much of a return, unless you actually think that having an American sniper over a Norwegian one is somehow going to be, in terms of market opportunity, a huge benefit.
Yeah, maybe you start marketing glasses with the American sniper. You know, there's an opportunity there, perhaps. Yeah, no, I think it's a hard one to justify because I don't think there's enough of a return on your investment. But I don't know. It does feel like we're entering after only one tournament in Counter-Strike 2. There are quite a lot of roster moves apparently happening. So, you know, a lot of the time we look at the player break as being the roster mania, but this might now be a period where we have another one. So
it's kind of just because the state that we find ourselves in with the game is that there's no prestige events until Katowice supposedly coming up next year. Depends how you look at the fall finals, world finals, but the main thing is that the teams are already set for those events. Or I think maybe the world finals has one more slot available for a qualifier spot, or like a, not a qualifier spot, but a like a blast circuit points spot. But the fall finals is already determined in terms of who's playing that. And so for most intents and purposes, people are now trying to build the roster that they're going to be taking into the first RMR and into Katowice, and they're thinking about all the moves they need to make in order to put together the most competitive team they can with the resources that they have. And I think when it comes to Complexity, I actually, this really does hurt to say this, but I actually just don't think they should even really go for OC, just because of everything we've already said here. It's just not enough return on investment. They might do it. I feel like the players are going to make a really heavy push for it. Like, I know for sure JT, Grim, and Floppy are probably going to be like, oh, we really want OC, but I feel like it's going to come down to Messioso and higher management to say, we just don't really think that makes a lot of sense. And I hope that Complexity, the thing is that I know Complexity do like playing with Halzerk to an extent. Like, they're not mad that they have to play with this guy. It's not like they're not like it's a forced marriage or anything like that.
Yeah, they're not sort of like under their breath, oh god, there's Halzerk again, you know?
Yeah, exactly. They're not just trying to shove him out of the team or anything like that. Yeah, but speaking of other rosters and ones that are kind of in an interesting position, I'd say one of the most interesting ones for me at this event was, in a weird way, it was Navi and Simple's absence, along with the fact that Blade picked up the op in his position in a couple of the spots that he played. And the whole Simple thing is just really, really strange. He's already expressed very publicly that he does not like CS2, that he says people should not even be playing the game for the first few months. And I kind of get it. I'm gonna be honest, I kind of get it. Like, thankfully for my position, I don't depend on playing Counter-Strike to make a living. I only just talk about the game and just watch professional matches for the most part. It does benefit me to play the game so I know what people are feeling in the game in certain situations, but I don't have to keep playing. And And I right now don't really want to play CS2 that badly. And so, but I don't have to. My job doesn't depend on it. For Simple, your job depends on playing the game. You should be playing the game. And this is to me a weird point for Navi where it's that simple. He dipped out of this event, and in some ways, I don't exactly buy the excuse. They said it was visa issues that he couldn't make it to Australia with, and I actually I think that's BS. I think like with Blade being able to make it, Ukrainian. With Bit being able to make it, Ukrainian. I don't see why Simple would have such a difficult time with it. And I feel like it was kind of like a PR concoction to say, no, you know what, Simple's not going to actually play at this. And I think that this is slightly confirmed by the fact that JL was saying in his own interview that some superstars aren't taking CS2 seriously. So, okay, first of all, are you buying my conspiracy theory that Simple just dipped on the event because he wanted to, or do you actually believe the visa stuff?
I don't really believe the visa stuff. Yeah,
Okay.
to be quite honest. Like that I felt like a massive indictment, almost like a protest from Simple saying like, "Oh, you guys have fun in Sydney. I'm not going. I'm not playing this game."
Okay, yeah, okay. So that then begs the question with the future of Navi and Simple, do you think this is just him taking one tournament off with, or do you think that is this the beginning of the end for Simple and Navi?
I just feels like there's like a massive frustration growing with him. Like there's even clips from him stream like he has been streaming CS2, so it's like he is playing the game, but in Face It and he's playing FPL and he's avoiding the matchmaking experience, which I think most people probably should be doing, by the way. Um, but it's strange to see that he has so much to say about the game and he's still actively playing it on the side and streaming it while the tournament is going on, which does add a little bit more credence to the whole visa thing, maybe a bit to me. Um, but I do worry about whether Simple is. I honestly feel like he might just take a break from the game, until he feels like he can make a comeback and come in with that like fresh motivation. Because him having these clips of him, having direct contact with Valve and not telling them the problems with the game because they're so out of touch with the community. Why should he have to tell them? That to me is like the wrong attitude to have as a professional player. As soon as CS2 came out, what Snappy was very vocal first to just be like, we are professionals, we are here to play the game, and we will do our best to try and play the game to the best of our abilities. Whether or not you have grievances, issues, that's fine, but you are there and paid to play this game professionally, so you make do with what you have.
Right. I think that there's been kind of it almost feels like other pros are subtweeting each other. Like there, I think Twistzz had the line about we need to be the I forgot the exact word he used, whether it was role models or essentially he was saying we need to be kind of the right figureheads so that we lead by example and we're not just kind of dissing the game. I feel like everybody's just subtweeting Simple. I actually think that the rest of the criticism in the community has been rather constructive. And even from talent members who can get pretty frustrated and vocal themselves, including myself, where I've been pretty upset, I would say that almost all of us have offered some sort of angle where we're saying this is what's bad about the game. This is what we would want fixed as soon as possible. Whereas when Simple was direct messaged by Valve themselves saying, what would you change? And he says live on his stream, he's like, I didn't even answer the question. I'm like, that is childish behavior. That is not being a good role model. And you had an opportunity to actually enact change with a game that your livelihood depends on, and you're not taking it upon yourself to actually basically benefit from it. Like if someone said, if the creator of basketball went to Shaquille O'Neal and said, hey, what would you change about basketball? And then Shaq had an opportunity to get into his ear and say, just make the hoop, four times bigger on free throws. Like just some stupid line like that. If Shaq could say that, obviously, like they wouldn't do it, hopefully, but you have the chance to actually tell the people making a game you make money from something that you could actually you could lie to them and just say, do something that's going to make me better at the game because I'm so good at this. Like if Simple just said, make the op faster movement speed, make the bullet bigger, like something, just make it more accurate or something, like make it so you can actually have like a 40 movement speed so you can essentially be walking with the op while shooting, something like that, and they listened, then Simple could just dominate the game again. And he just decides that he wants to throw a little bit of a silent tantrum and not even respond to them. That's just such a wasted opportunity by him. I do want to create a distinction here, though, in terms of the information regarding the Simple, not his lack of arrival, is that Navi never said actually in their official statement why he didn't go. It was actually Luis Mira that said, according to sources, the reason Simple isn't attending with Navi is that his EU residency papers aren't ready yet. And so it's kind of weird because you would expect if that is the reason, then why would Navi have actually any reason not to just say that outright? And so I trust Luis Mira a lot. I think he's one of the most respectable journalists that gets things right in this space. In fact, I think his track record is incredibly strong, and anything that he does come out with and publishes or even tweets, I have reason to believe that he has done his due diligence and that his sources are probably correct. But I think that this could be a one time where maybe he heard something from internally at Navi, and someone that is generally reputable actually was trying to save Simple's ass on this kind of situation. Like I'm willing to go that far as like I really really respect Luis, but I think like, and I bet his source was accurate at most times more than not, but this might be a time where I'm just like I think Simple is just I don't know what his future holds. I don't know if he's going to be taking an indefinite break. The streaming thing with Simple is interesting because, like you're saying, he has been playing the game quite a bit, but to be such a bad leader of people as they usher in the new era of CS2, I don't really mind in some ways if he bows out for a bit here and there, just so that he can collect himself again, because I'm sure that things in his life are probably a little bit frustrating right now, and I hope that he's able to like come back, because I purely just love watching this guy compete. But if he's gonna just kind of be a negative influence on the scene, maybe he should just step away for a little bit, because that kind of sours a lot of people's perceptions about what CS2 is, and I think that he's just stoking the flame of negative and not even constructive criticism.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. I think there are some voices that are willing to take a more level-headed approach and try and approach it from understanding how the game developer is thinking about it and what their angle is and what their aims are. But yeah, maybe I do think it's just about taking time away. So I'd wish him the best if he does decide to go for that.
Okay. Let's keep moving through some of these other rosters. So another one that seems to be coming together right now. There have been reports on Dust 2. Dust 2 US is the first reputable one I saw regarding this one. Is all the Liquid moves and kind of where they are and what stages they're in. This is Liquid picking up Skulls and cadiaN letting OC walk away. And so their 5-man lineup would be, in addition, also Twistzz. They would basically only be using Yakindar and Naf from the previous 5-man. And also Daps would be let go as well on this team in the stead of, or they would bring in Zeus in his stead. And so the official or unofficial but somewhat leaked 5-man lineup for Liquid is Skulls, cadiaN, Yakindar, Naf, Twistzz, Coach, Zeus. First thought, okay, actually, give me a letter grade. Give me a letter grade for, like, in relation to upgrade or downgrade.
In relation to upgrade or downgrade.
So based off the last roster, is this an A, or do you think it's worse F?
No, I think it's an A.
Okay.
I think this team cooks.
Yeah, okay. I think okay.
They just have so many like aggressive players. I can't find myself not enjoying watching these guys play.
Right. And one thing that I think that is okay, I'll say this. We can look at the names Twistzz, Skulls, cadiaN, and think of like, oh, how are they going to fit together with Yakindar and Naf? I'm just going to say outright, the first thing that will be drastically different about this Liquid roster versus probably the last 5 years of Liquid is that they have an Opper that is going to be taking a lot of initiative, that's going to be trying to open up rounds on CT side very consistently, and will probably design some of the CT playbook around himself. Whereas before with OC and Nitro, there really wasn't a very strong emphasis on the Opper of the team, and it was mostly just based off of rifle plays to get things kicked off on defenses. And so for cadiaN, I used to download cadiaN demos for just to learn all of the openers on various maps, because cadiaN would just go through them. Like he would just run down the list on every single map of every single play you can make with the op. And so he's got an encyclopedic knowledge of how to get first picks. Whether he hits the shot is a different story. Like he's a good opper in terms of macro decision making. Probably in terms of the micro, you wouldn't say he's top 5 in the world, but in terms of like the whole picture, cadiaN is a great opper. Like cadiaN is in, I would say, the B plus tier of oppers in tier 1 CS. I'm not going to put him in that S tier or A tier, but like he kind of makes, it's like, this is like one of those, it's not about the size, it's about like the motion. That's kind of cadiaN, you know, like he's not gifted with like all the mechanics of everybody else, but
he's
he
got
knows
technique.
Yeah, he's got technique. He's got technique, and he knows where to position himself to have the most impact possible. So that's where cadiaN really his strengths lie for me, and I think that with like that could make the Liquid defense so much more dynamic. That's kind of what I want to get at. I haven't really seen a Liquid CT side that isn't predicated for a while on anything but riflers making aggressive plays and trying to set themselves up. And usually it's kind of like a support op. Like it's usually Nitro throwing flashes for these guys. It's OC throwing flashes for these guys. Like I want to finally see Liquid build out their openers on defensive sides. And I know that's going to happen with this roster. So it gives them a lot of flexibility. I will say the one thing that is a little bit curious about this roster to me, if I have to have one drawback, and probably I kind of put you on the spot with F or A. I mean there were other letter grades in between. I'd probably give this more like a B, because Skulls, despite being incredibly strong as an individual, I'm not certain of his abilities in English, and so I don't know if there's going to be a learning curve there.
Yeah, and he's the only unknown for me as well, because I was just thinking, like, yes, I agree with you, like, active CT sides and getting solid openers, but also this team is, like, very clutch. Like, if you think you have Naf, Twistzz, cadiaN,
oh, yeah.
like, these guys will cook in clutches so well. So you have your early game sorted, you have your late game sorted. Yeah, it is also just about team cohesion, I think, for this roster. So I'm sure it's a consideration that they've already. I mean, they must have already drawn it up and sat him down and just said, okay, I mean, his English just works. But yeah, it would be weird for that to be the hurdle, because Skulls is a very, very skilled player that I'd hate to see have like this experience where he goes to a foreign team and just can't make it work.
The Zeus move on top of that, I
don't know that I rate that quite as highly, I'll be honest.
Ooh. Okay.
Wait, okay, I didn't actually see which Zeus is this.
This is Brazilian Zeus. This isn't
Brazilian Zeus.
This isn't Eastern European Zeus.
Okay, no, okay, I back it a bit more then.
You thought it was gonna be Zeus from like?
I thought it was gonna be like
Gambit.
Ukrainian Zeus.
Okay, yeah. Okay, Gambit, Navi,
that was
Zeus.
where my brain went.
Okay. No, yeah. The fact that it's Brazilian Zeus, I will say he hasn't really had the best track record lately. Like, what was Zeus? Zeus was last coaching for. I'm trying to actually remember what team it was actually. Let me just look this up. He was last coaching for Fluxo, and that was probably the worst called team I have ever seen in Counter-Strike in the last year. Okay, at the RMR for the Americas region, where Fluxo was actually able to make it through by beating, by the way, Paqueta for the spot. Paqueta, by the way, is a team of Destiny, Venom, Zera, Ale, Yell, and Nithon. And Fluxo was a team of Phelps, Lukowski, VSM, Woody, and History. Don't have to worry about who History is really for that matter, but like the talent was so obviously stacked in the favor of Fluxo that the way that Fluxo were playing when Zeus was the coach, by the way, was so puggy. They would just run out of all directions at the same time. Lukowski would try to run out and find openers with a couple flashes. Phelps would do like an aggressive lurk on the other side of the map at the same time. And then Woody would just frequently call very bad mid rounds, like very, very bad. Like didn't know when to pause, didn't know when to like go for the next like space. Sometimes they would overextend once they already have space. Like there were moments with Fluxo where it was simply, I've actually created a code word lately with teammates in that I pug with or play matchmaking Premier with is like you take your hands off the mouse. Like you just disconnect. Like basically the word is disconnect because it's just like if we just stop moving, we won't lose. You know, we're up 4v2 in a post plant. Just disconnect. Like don't worry about anything. Don't go for that extra peek. And Fluxo would always fail to disconnect. They'd always just keep pushing, and it's like this round was over, guys. Like you did not need to keep moving forward. And so Zeus has an incredible track record before that. Like he coached the major winning LGSK lineups. He probably helped Fallen in some ways create the style that made them as strong as they were. He was the coach of Liquid for a couple of years while they were fairly strong. And then he kind of had some sort of weird moments. On EG, actually, he was a pretty solid coach. I think this was during the online era where they were winning some of the online sort of RMR events. But then when he was Oplano's coach and Fluxo's coach for the last couple of years, I would say that my opinion of him has lightly taken a downswing. So I don't know really how to rate Zeus right now.
I will just add a little bit here. I think he actually he's a good in-game leader. And he's done that from the coaching role for a lot of these online officials, because I've watched Fluxo play online, and it is nothing like what you just said. You know, nothing like what you just described. You know, they played very like reactive, played good like map control, held map control. You know, never didn't feel like they overstepped very frequently, aside from when they were like
when did you watch them? When did you watch them?
I watched them in early March or early February. And then I also watched them before Zeus. I think it was like June like late last year.
Okay.
The end of last year.
Okay. If it were June at the end of last year, I mean, when Zeus wasn't on the team, I assume that they were probably called very differently. And well, February would have been
a couple of roster moves as well, right?
Yeah. It would have been a fairly different team than the one that went into the RMR. But when Zeus was on it, I felt like they were playing like freaks.
Fair enough. Yeah, I just feel like he probably doesn't have control. Maybe it's about like the actual coaching of it, because I feel like if he's calling from a coaching role for online play, I'm sure he does fine. You know, I'm sure he's able to rein everybody in and get that active voice. But when you're actually at an event, you can't do that. So,
right. Okay. One more move that has just came up. I feared that this is where Heroic would go, but they will be playing with dupreeh for the remainder of 2023. So that I think means that they're going to be playing the Fall and World Finals with dupreeh. And for what are your first takes on this move?
Yeah, I mean, is he in-game leading? I think that would be the first question, because I don't expect you're gonna get good production out of dupreeh as a player. Like you're there for his veterancy mainly for this roster. So, you know, if I saw this move and I took off the nameplate and I think you're bringing in a veteran to this heroic roster, I immediately think he's going to be in-game leading. Whether or not that's his role to begin with or not, it almost doesn't make sense for anyone else in this roster to take up that responsibility when you're having to fill the void of not only an in-game leader but an AWPer as well. Like who takes over those roles is another dynamic that they have to almost sort out amongst the core outside of the dupreeh move.
This is about as bad of a move as you could make in my eyes. I don't. There's cadiaN was the heart of this team. He was the AWPer. He was the in-game leader. He helped create the system that made Heroic into the world beater team that were always consistently punching above their weight, even with what you would have considered a slightly underpowered lineup. And so to bring in a player that Vitality has already discarded because they didn't see him being the future of that roster or being the future of what is winning Counter-Strike, Heroic are taking a massive step back. This is to me one of the biggest downgrades you could have gone for. There were a few ways you could have had changes that would have made things interesting. Like, for example, if you brought Glaive on, at least you would bring a new in-game leader that would have a winning history, and one that I'm sure can call in very big clutch time moments better than anybody. But dupreeh has stated on HLTV Confirmed that he is too dumb. He thinks he's too dumb to call. Like, those are his words to do it. So in that case, forcing the in-game leading duties onto somebody else, and it might be Sound, maybe it's Shush calling from a more supportive position. I doubt it would be Twistzz. I doubt it would be Yabby. I think so. If it's Sound or Shush that's calling, I just feel like those are the guys that were already letting Heroic down before in terms of big moments and not calming as much as they should have. Because when cadiaN was talking about why they would lose some of these big games, he would, unfortunately, but realistically, sometimes throw his teammates under the bus and say, my team let me down. They stopped talking. They became less communicative. And if any of those players who clammed up in big moments before is now fully responsible for being the in-game leader, I don't see how this team could be anything but worse than what they were with cadiaN. And now, Stound likely switching to the Opera role. I mean, I'm just going to say, Stound's going to switch to the Opera role if this is the case. I think Stound is actually, mechanically speaking, a better Opera than cadiaN, but he also was able to benefit from the fact that whenever he picked it up before, he was the secondary Opera, and for that reason, he's much harder to game plan around. Stound doesn't know what it's like to be a primary Opera who's game planned against. So in some ways, for this Heroic team, I actually think that their best chance to win an event, and weirdly it's possible, is you use the bones of the old Heroic framework for how you played Counter-Strike. You have Stound, who's this unknown quantity as an Opera, and then you have dupreeh, who's going to be fired up. And if this honeymoon doesn't go flawlessly, I'm glad it's a short contract as far as I'm aware. That's all I'm going to say, because if dupreeh's on this team and they're not just winning immediately, they're not going to win in the future.
It has been a long time since dupreeh has AWP'd. Because he did AWP over Device that one when Device stepped like he had a injury or like an illness, right?
Yes.
I forget which tournament. And he did a pretty good job, from what I remember. But it has been many years since that tournament.
That's been at least 5 years. That's been like 5 years, I think.
Yeah.
I think that was 2018. A long time ago. Yeah.
God, the time has flown. But yeah, no, I think it's very strange. I will say it's just a tidbit because I don't really have too much to add on. Shush, I played him in a Premier game, and he was AWPing versus me on Ancient, and he was banging me out. So maybe Shush is taking up the AWP and Stound's in-game leading. I would much rather a distribution of the responsibilities if we're gonna fill cadiaN's shoes with the people on the roster. Like if Stound is in-game leading and AWPing and he's just full on taking all the responsibilities, this roster I don't think survives. Like Stound might feel like he's up to the task, but I just don't think this team is gonna have the legs it needs to continue. So
agreed. It's gonna be very telling immediately for me whether dupreeh even really has a future as a tier 1 player. If he's unable to put up serviceable numbers in a non-in-game leading role, then I would be shocked if dupreeh can really even extend his career. And actually on that note, there's been kind of some leaks. These are, like, at this point we're getting to, I'd say, less official territory, but there's been some, and I kind of want to just like lightly touch on these just because it's fun as a thought exercise. So there is talk that, say, Magisk would actually leave Vitality to join Falcons and rejoin with Zonic. So if Magisk were to leave, is there anybody, there's also the rumor that maybe Twistzz goes to Falcons instead of Liquid, but it's from a, like, the reporting for Twistzz to join Liquid is much more of a trusted source to me than the people that are saying Twistzz would go to Falcons. And I'll just say it, Dust2 and HLTV for that matter are saying Twistzz is being targeted and more likely to go to Liquid, whereas Harumi is saying that it's going to be Twistzz is going to Falcons, or Twistzz is going to go to Vitality for Magisk for that matter. But with Vitality potentially losing Magisk, like, what do you think that does to the team if you lose that kind of steady presence?
Yeah, no, I mean, to me, this felt like more of a reaction to Zonic leaving. Like, if Magisk is going to leave, it's to do with dupreeh and Zonic because they all went there as a trio. I actually think it could benefit Vitality, but I think like you would almost need like a Rain type character because maybe I'm thinking only of FaZe players because of what we discussed earlier in the show. But you would want like a player that's willing to sort of sacrifice his ideal positions just for the benefit of the squad because I think Magisk did that a lot for Vitality in terms of like role swapping, even with dupreeh when he was on the team. Um, yeah, I don't know who fits into that role perfectly, but I don't think it changes the dynamic of like how Vitality play. Like I don't think it's gonna change their experience bar when it comes to when they're in the playoffs or who's gonna have big moments. I think it's just about finding the right fit for his roles because I think you've got enough star power between ZywOo, Spinks, Flames that you only really need like a supplementary figure in that position.
I I'll say I slightly disagree with it being just a reaction to like I slightly disagree with Vitality doing better for this or being okay with this. Like Magisk to me was such a stable force as an anchor for Vitality that even though it feels like he's been around for so long, he's been so dependable in terms of pure output. And so it feels like that's a very difficult figure to replace. If I were to go for anyone just from I guess from FaZe to pick them apart, I think Rops could be a very natural fit for Magisk. I think he can play even though he doesn't have to play or is not forced to play all of the same anchor positions as Magisk. I actually think that he's incredibly capable when he does end up playing some of those positions. It doesn't seem to naturally fit all of his like his strengths, but in terms of skill set, I would say it's a strong replacement. But I also think that this is so frustrating because I with Zonic and with Magisk, let's just say Zonic for now, because we know that he's already moved on to Falcons. I it's very strange where when a coach will say that he believes in this and he likes the project and it's not about the money, but we all know it's about the money. And so I find that just so it's like you're losing good faith in now like everything you say in future interviews for me when you do say that. And it's okay. It's okay to say it's about money. Like some people, influencers for that matter, take up weird individual sponsorships and do little ad things for money. And that's just how this world works. And if you're not willing to say that, then and not be upfront with that, I feel like I just can't trust you because I guess nobody wants to actually bring that up, even though it's reality. Like the reason, like I'll just be honest with all of these viewers here, like a reason to do this podcast right now is maybe I'll put a sponsor on it in the future. I enjoy doing it, don't get me wrong, but if I kept doing it and it got a lot of money and because I started getting sponsorships from this podcast, that's a big reason. That's a motivating factor for me. Like I'm honest with my listeners. I'm honest with other people. Whereas if I'm just like, no, it's for the glory of doing the podcast only, that's partially true. I like doing a good podcast. I like doing the podcast that I do. And I like talking about this space a lot. Like I've turned a hobby into a living for me, but it's also about making it a living. And so like, if you want to shore up your future and your kids' future because you take up a really hefty deal as a coach, that's also clearly part of the equation here.
I'd like to also just clarify, like, even though as much as you want like clarity from players or coaches or whatever when they give interviews, no one is ever going to just say, "Yeah, I only signed with these guys for the money," because that's bad for the brand. Like the PR
Yeah.
guy would be tearing his hair out. You'd maybe get fined just saying, "What, you don't believe in the project? What, you don't want to be here? You only we paid all this money for you, and you don't like any of the things other than the money." That to me would be a bit ridiculous. Whereas for a podcast, you build your brand maybe around clarity. So it's a little different, I would say. But
Sure.
I if I lose good faith in his future interviews, just so long as you're not talking about how or where his money is, basically. I'm sure he'll tell you everything in good faith about the team. I still have faith in Sonic to do that.
Yeah, and if he's actually able to pick up a couple cool pieces here, like have you actually taken a look at this Falcons roster and who's on it right
Not
now?
particularly.
Okay.
Everybody was talking about Falcons so much like before Sydney. and
Yeah.
like all these podcasts about like all the roster moves they're gonna make, and I just haven't even really thought of them as like a competitive team at
No,
all.
they're not.
So
They're not worth looking at really. But if they do get Magisk, I'm just gonna go out on a limb here and say they probably do it for a player like Lonks because right now they have NDK, they have Body, they have MHL, they have Lonks, and they have Boros. Boros is such an untapped potential type player, and NBK, Grounding Force, Body. I think he actually Body's in game leading for them, and then MHL's an opper. So for me, Lonks is the odd man out in this sort of roster, and so I would say that Magisk would come in for him. I don't know the roles on Falcons. I haven't watched enough Falcons games to tell you who's playing what positions, but I think you could make it work with Magisk there. And I still think that they're probably a piece or two away from being a team that's going to be breaching into the top 15. But with Magisk, the potential of Boros, and actually what I've seen from MHL, who I actually think could probably be one of the better operas in the world, give him some time, then this is a like this is still I still think they need to do something. And whether that's poach someone from FaZe, like going to FaZe has to be the most obvious choice here. If you're to still keep building upon what they seem to be creating, uh, getting someone like cadiaN or getting somebody like Rops, or if you want something that's more for the present as opposed to the future, you go for Brokey over MHL, even Rain for that matter. Like all of those probably, well, they would elevate this team and give you a shot at really actually start qualifying for some big events.
yeah, would you say in terms of the names you listed, like Lonks first on the chopping block, NBK next, and then maybe you go like MHL
I
or
would actually
Body?
replace Body a little earlier
Okay.
because if the team hasn't really achieved anything with Body as the in-game leader, who I am strongly assuming he is, by the way, I'm actually not 100% certain given I haven't been watching much Falcon stuff. In fact, you know what?
Mhm.
I'll just check this right now. I'm fairly certain. Yeah. Well, oh no, actually on Liquipedia they list NBK as the captain. Okay.
Okay.
So, uh,
Body in-game led for most of his career after the G2 stuff, so I mean, it's a
yeah.
reasonable assumption. So
Yeah, that's why I said it. But okay, actually, yeah, it says NBK's captain and in-game leader. So yeah, I guess Body's pretty much first up then. Uh, I mean, it just depends who you can get. I mean, if you can get cadiaN, NBK's out. If you can get, say, a Rain or Rops, you're taking Lonks and Body out. So
yeah,
that's that's
that's
that's
fair.
that's where it is for me. Okay. I want to do one last thing with you before we close this out. So the HLTV rankings actually just updated, and so if you're able to bring this up, I want to go through kind of the top seven-ish teams or something, and we'll do a power rankings that's based off of this. And so as it stands, as the time of this recording, 1:45 p.m. East Coast time on Monday, October 23rd, number one HLTV ranked team G2 just moved up 2 slots to supplant Vitality, who actually now moved to third. ENCE is in second. Maus is in fourth. And FaZe is in fifth. They moved up 2 slots. And then Complexity moved up 6 spots to eighth. And between FaZe and Complexity in sixth and seventh are Navi and Heroic. So I'll just read that all out 1 through 8 again. 1 G2, 2 ENCE, 3 Vitality, 4 Maus, 5 FaZe, 6 Navi, 7 Heroic, 8 Complexity. How would you change that up if you were to build a power ranking for more the present, like we're talking present form, not like past 3 months or everything like that? If you built a ranking who's going to win the tournament tomorrow, and assuming that these are the rosters they take into them, so let's ignore the fact that FaZe is getting broken apart more than likely, how would you rank these teams?
So are we still considering FaZe an option,
Yes,
like
yes, yes,
within this
yes,
power ranking?
yes,
Yeah.
yes,
Okay.
yes.
In terms of like actual feasibility to win it, I feel like ENCE is like a firm two, 100%.
Mm-hmm.
Always a contender, never bridesmaid, never the bride. Um, I'd say maybe I'd probably go FaZe, ENCE, G2, Maus, then Vitality, Navi, Heroic.
And Complexity's still dead last.
Oh, well, you said
Oh, but it's
oh
eighth. But
sorry.
it's eighth. But it's eighth. Yeah.
Then I would put complexity probably sixth ahead of Navi then.
Okay.
So it'll be yeah. So phase ends G2, Maus, complexity, Navi, heroic. I think maybe I missed vitality there, but vitality is like
You
fourth,
know,
fifth.
wait, okay.
I might have just excluded one.
Complexity just owned G2 in a match.
I do know that. That
Yeah.
is true.
Yeah.
But I think in term I know you're saying like current form, but I also don't think that this tournament is a total litmus test for what we can expect. Like I think I've seen too much good from G2 to just dismiss that for the first CS2 event.
No, I'm glad that you stand firm on your position because I wouldn't really. I think the highest I could put complexity is fifth. I'd probably actually, based off of what I saw at actually this event, I would have phase number one. I would have G2 number two still, even though they did lose to complexity, and then I would probably have. I actually might put. I think I actually might put Maus third. So it would be phase G2 Maus complexity ents and then actually no, I put vitality above them too. So I think complexity is sixth and then Navi and then I'd have heroic dead last. Navi right now is seventh.
Yeah. I think
Yeah.
that's the ending of that is identical to mine. So.
Yeah, I think I have ents a little bit lower than you because I just think that I guess the way that they lost to FaZe was pretty humiliating, and they very convincingly lost to me to G2 in the upper bracket final. They also barely, in some ways, kind of barely beat Fnatic, who I rate very poorly right now. And so I think CS2 is not treating ents that well just yet. In fact, I'll put complexity above ents. I put complexity above ents. So I put phase 1, G2 2, 3 Maus, 4 vitality, 5 complexity, 6 ents, 7 Navi, 8 heroic. That's how I do this. So the seeding would be like that. Yeah.
Do you find it interesting? And this is a point I wanted to kind of come back to because I kind of remembered it midway through. Do you find it interesting that FaZe are at the top? Well, one, they win the tournament in Sydney, but they're at the top of our list as one of the teams that almost felt like they didn't abuse the new mechanics as much as like literally any other team at the tournament. Like,
Yeah.
I didn't think I saw many. I mean, there were rounds where they blew open smokes, but I almost felt like they didn't do it anywhere near as much as you saw like Maus or ents or Complexity do it like in defaults. Like I saw them do it like every round at the start of rounds to like break open the wall, whereas FaZe just kind of let them sit and almost played like it was CS:GO still. So
Well, I'll say one thing. I think that the one thing that FaZe seem to be pretty good at right now is weirdly like I don't remember, this hasn't been their pick for a while, but they were really leaning on Nuke really heavily at this event. And when I talked to actually George Snorts from Evil Geniuses, now just man formerly known as George Snorts, now just
formerly,
known as
yes, of course.
George. And the way that he talked about it was like I asked him what map he thought changed the most in terms of meta in CS2, and he said it was Nuke. And that's because of the outside smokes being a little bit shorter, and now you can kind of play around with shooting around the corner or blowing the smoke open and kind of defending in a way that gives you more information. And FaZe, despite the fact that on other maps I did feel like they were playing relatively standard and didn't change too much of their formula to still win this event, I think that their Nuke outside defense was something where Rain felt pretty damn comfortable in terms of the fights that he was taking, where he would play a lot of times like close to mini garage and then just shoot a bit through the edge of the smoke to try to just like spot somebody on the side of it. And in the grand finals, he actually didn't really have the best Nuke, but I remember in some of the earlier ones throughout the tournament, he was just finding a lot in terms of information. And so I think that's something where the little details of what FaZe is doing in the micro sense on that map is actually pretty strong and probably fairly forward thinking, where it's almost just like Rain, this is an old dog learning some new tricks, and that is kind of exciting with them. But I do agree that when it comes to the other maps, I don't feel like they were blowing smokes nearly as much as other teams. Like Complexity felt like they were so ready to do it in a lot of different ways. G2 even was doing it more than FaZe were. So yeah, I think they kind of just, maybe in some ways other people were overwhelmed by the opportunities that presented themselves because of the new mechanics, and FaZe were like, let's just focus on the basics.
Yeah. It just felt like they didn't try as hard to make it work as other teams did. Like they almost lived and died by that sword. Some teams where they blow up in a smoke, they get info, there would be nobody there. And I think I remember from some of these nuke phase games, because there were a lot of them. Is that, you know, they blow up in a smoke, and then that would almost be like a timing you could exploit afterwards when the smoke rebuilt to walk through the smoke because it had just been cleared moments ago. So
That's true.
yeah, I just found FaZe interesting because they're not new mechanics abusers as much.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's probably going to change, though, over time. I think that that's kind of like first tournament, new game, probably the team that just keeps things as simple as possible will probably just come out on top because all the fundamentals will kick in a little bit more. But I think that's actually going to bring us to a close for this episode. But I wanted to give you a chance to just plug whatever you want to in terms of stuff you're doing across the internet. So what's on the horizon for Yuumi?
Well, I am doing ESL Challenger League. I kick off with some of the European games tomorrow, and I'm doing Asia in a couple of weeks. Doing some ESL Challenger Yonkoping qualifiers as well. Whether or not I go to that event, you'll have to find out. And I do a long-standing prediction podcast with King T on his channel. So, you know, shout out King T, good guy.
Awesome guy.
Hammering me in the prediction series, by the way, because I can't predict tournaments for shit. So, yeah, aside from that, kind of that's all I got going on. And it's Yuumi TV on Twitter because I can't get at Yuumi because Twitter is just unrelated. I can't do it. I've
Is someone
reported that
sitting
guy
on
so
that?
many times. He's inactive. He's never tweeted or liked anything. Doesn't follow anyone. Goddamn Elon.
I think that they're actually going to do something about that. They said that inactive accounts, they're going to maybe remove them at some point. So you just got to stay locked in and
Yeah.
make sure that you catch exactly when they do that because someone else
I'll
is going to
just
jump
keep
on
on
it.
hammering it. I'll just keep on doing it.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being a great guest. It's always been great to talk to you. And I guess for me, I guess people, I mean, I'm just going to be streaming a bunch this week. So yeah, be sure to tune into all that. And I'm glad that we're rebooting this podcast. By we, I mean me. Yuumi is just a guest for this episode. I'm sure he'll bring him back in the future.
I was the easily probable guest as you introed at the start. Let me just grab anybody, and that's why we've got Yuumi.
I mean, okay, also to Yumi's credit, Yuumi is probably the only person I know that was actually ruining his entire UK sleep schedule just to watch this tournament. Like, I was ruining mine in New York to watch the first game of every night, but I was not staying up for both, so I would have to watch back the second game when I got up the next day. So that's why I got Yuumi. He watched all this shit live. So appreciate you once again, and
Of course, my pleasure.
that's gonna be it for this one. Thanks.